Okay, our next lesson is about something called monetary policy. Now, monetary policy, we learned about in our last lesson. And as a quick review, we remember that it's enacted by the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank, as we learned in our last lesson, has a number of responsibilities, and here are what they are. Um, the most important are they regulate the banking system, they act as a lender of last resort to banks that are in distress, they process checks, and then most importantly for this lesson and really for this course is that they enact monetary policy. In other words, they control the amount of money in the economy, and because they do that, they control interest rates. And by doing that, they control unemployment and inflation, at least to some extent. And you'll notice that dollar bill there. Across the very top of the dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve Note. That dollar bill is produced and belongs to the Federal Reserve Bank. It's the Fed's job to determine how much of that stuff, that green money, is floating around the economy. Now, as a quick review, exactly how does it control interest rates? Remember, the Fed controls the supply of money. So if interest rates are at R1 and the Fed wants them to decrease, remember what it has to do is increase the money supply, and that would lower interest rates. It can do that by the three options I noted up on the top of the screen. Lower discount rates, lower the reserve requirement, or buy bonds on the open market. Any of those three tools would do what just happened here. The money supply would increase and interest rates would decrease. By the same token, the Fed can also raise interest rates. If it's at R1 and the Fed wants them to rise, it can decrease the money supply or shift it to the left, in which case it would increase the interest rates. And by decreasing MS, again, you can see R is going to increase. The question we're going to ask in this lesson is, why would the Fed want to do that? Why would the Fed sometimes want interest rates to rise? And why would the Fed sometimes want interest rates to decrease? A very good question. To answer that question, we need to look at two graphs which we should be becoming pretty familiar with: the money market and the aggregate market. Okay, the aggregate market we see there to the right. And we notice that we have a current price level and a current output. And to the left, we have our money market, and we can see that at the moment we have a money supply, and we'll throw in a money demand curve there as well, which of course means we have also a current interest rate. Okay, right now, we're going to look at what we've got. So what this means as we look at these together is that at that current interest rate, there's a certain amount of things that people are interested in producing and buying and selling. How does a change in the money supply and a change in interest rates change how much people are willing to buy and sell? Well, let's take a look. Suppose the Fed decided to increase the money supply. Now, by increasing the money supply, what do we know happens? We know that interest rates will decrease. Okay, now why is that important? That's important because what it means is, why do banks charge interest generally? Generally, the reason that anybody who's loaning money charges interest is so that they make money back on their loan, that they actually gain something for loaning that money. Well, the lower the interest rates they charge are, the more likely someone else is to borrow money. So if I can borrow money at a 10% interest rate, I'm more likely to borrow that money than I would be if I had to borrow it at a 20% interest rate, because I'm paying back less to the person or institution that's lending me the money. So lower interest rates means that people are going to buy more. It also might mean that they're willing to invest more in things like factories and equipment. And because all that's true, think about what we just said. Lower interest rates mean that people are going to spend more and invest more. What does that sound like? Consumption and investment? We should be immediately now thinking about aggregate demand. That lower interest rate causes people to spend more and invest more, and thus increase aggregate demand. And of course, when we increase aggregate demand, we push prices up and we push our GDP or output to the right, which means inflation is rising and unemployment, is decreasing. That's how monetary policy works. By controlling interest rates, the Fed controls how much, to some degree, how much people consume and how much they invest. Now, this power is not unlimited. The truth is no matter how low the interest rate is, if you don't need a car, some people just won't buy a car. But for some people, a lower interest rate might entice them to buy a car when they maybe could use one, but maybe didn't. But the lower interest rate pushes them into buying that car and therefore increases aggregate demand. That's how the Fed enacts monetary policy. By the way, this example would be an example of what's called expansionary monetary policy, where we're essentially expanding the economy. Okay? Why would the Fed do this? Well, suppose the Fed had a recession on its hands, like the situation we have illustrated right here. If the Fed had that situation, then what would it do? It would increase the money supply. That would lower interest rates. Because interest rates were lower, aggregate demand would increase as people spent more on consumption and investment, and prices and our GDP would rise. That's how the Fed helps to control the economy. By controlling interest rates, it controls aggregate demand. Now, again, this power is not limitless, but that's how it works. Here's a quick summary one more time, and if you want to write it down, feel free at this moment. We'll do it one more time. In this instance, the economy is weak and has high unemployment caused by low aggregate demand. Increasing the money supply lowers interest rates, which makes borrowing money for consumption, investment, and by the way, yes, government spending as well. And I've capitalized all those to remind you they're all components of GDP. Thus, aggregate demand increases and gets us closer to full employment. Y star. That's what the Fed is ultimately trying to accomplish. Now, if the Fed had an inflationary problem on its hands, it could actually do just the opposite. It could decrease the money supply. That would raise interest rates. When interest rates rose, it would be more difficult for people to borrow money, so they would spend less, which would decrease aggregate demand and drive prices down and GDP to the left. Because that's true, inflation has now decreased and unemployment has increased, getting us closer to full employment again. Again, let's summarize it. In this case, the economy is overheating and has high inflation caused by the high aggregate demand. Decreasing the money supply raises interest rates, which makes borrowing money for consumption, investment, and government spending more difficult. Thus, aggregate demand decreases and gets us closer to full employment. This is how the Fed works. Now, our last situation, stagflation, the Fed has less ability to control. So we're going to stick for right now with monetary policy, just dealing with how it fixes recessions and inflationary gaps by controlling aggregate demand. All right, let's try an example together. The economy is below full employment right now. Select one action the Fed might take to address the situation. Illustrate the impact on the money market, nominal interest rates, and aggregate demand. All right, take just a moment, stop the video if you need to, and sketch in your mind or on paper exactly what will this look like graphically. Okay, let's see how we did. So the first thing is the Fed could do something. What could it do? It could buy bonds. That's one of the options it might choose. It could also have lowered the reserve requirement or could have lowered the discount rate. Any of those would have worked. But what would the result be? The result would be, now first we got to draw in our long run aggregate supply curve because it tells us in the question that we're below full employment. Now that we have that there, we can see we're definitely below full employment. Now, what does the Fed want to do? It wants to increase the money supply, thus lowering interest rates, and that will increase aggregate demand and increase prices and output. All right, that's a pretty good first example. Let's try another. This time the economy is above full employment. Choose an open market operation the Fed could use to address the issue. Show the impact on nominal interest rates, aggregate demand, prices, and our GDP. Again, we'll stop here for a moment and give you a shot, and then click play again when you're ready. Okay, now it's important to highlight in this case, the question specifically asks us to use open market operations. Now the Fed normally has 3 tools to choose from, but because they specifically said open market operations, we have to deal with bonds. And in this case, since we have an inflation problem, we're above full employment, the Fed should sell bonds. And I made a note here, it's the only correct answer since it specified that we needed open market operations. All right. Because of that, what should we do? Well, first thing we're going to do is draw in our long run aggregate supply curve. That shows us that yes, we in fact have an inflationary problem. Remember, the long run aggregate supply curve shows us where full employment should be. If we have an inflationary problem, we must be to the left of that. Y1 must be to the left of Y star. What do we do to solve this problem? We decrease the money supply, again, by selling those bonds. That raises interest rates, and that will decrease aggregate demand, thus decreasing prices and decreasing our GDP. Okay, let's have you try one. You're going to start from scratch here. The economy is in an inflationary gap. Identify one policy the central bank or the Fed could use to address the issue. Using a graph of the money market and the aggregate market, illustrate the impact on nominal interest rates, aggregate demand, and our GDP. And since we just used selling bonds in our last question, maybe I would suggest that you suggest one of the other two options the Fed might have. Stop the video, sketch your graph, and then we'll come back and discuss. Okay, let's go ahead and see how we did. So we have an inflationary gap problem. So what should the Fed do? Again, the Fed could do any one of these. It could sell bonds, it could increase the reserve requirement, or it could increase the discount rate. What would that look like? Well, first of all, here's our money market. Hopefully you drew something that looked like that to start off with. And again, all those abbreviations are perfectly acceptable. Then hopefully you drew this as a starting point for your aggregate market. Now what we want to do is show the change that's going to occur. Because you were selling bonds or increasing the reserve requirement or increasing the discount rate, you lowered the money supply, which raised interest rates. In turn, that lowered aggregate demand or decreased aggregate demand, which caused prices to decrease and our GDP to decrease. All right, continue with your worksheets in this module.